The hearing will come to order, and good afternoon to everyone. This hearing on the UN Relief and Works Agency, or UNRWA, its decades-long complicity in the most vicious forms of anti-Semitism, anti-Semitic hate, with a focus today on the so-called independent review by Ms. Catherine Colona, will come to order. Hillel Neuer, Executive Director of UN Watch, will testify today that the, quote, Colona review was not independent. The verdict was determined in advance. He goes on to say UN Watch has demonstrated in detail why the Colona review was not truly independent, including because of the manifest bias and conflicts of interest of the examiners, and because both the UN and UNRWA declared the outcome in advance in a mandate explicitly designated not to objectively examine potential wrongdoing, but rather to reassure the donors, close quote. The revelations of recent months about UNRWA's complicity in the anti-Semitic atrocities of October 7th and the involvement in supplying Hamas and protecting its terror tunnels has been a dramatic wake-up call for a lot of people to the reality that UNRWA is one of the chief drivers of conflict between Palestinians and Israelis. This is the fourth hearing on UNRWA and related UN agencies that I've chaired in the past 12 months alone. 21 years ago, in 2003, I offered an amendment that passed the House of Representatives to defund UNRWA. The Senate failed to take action. I and many of my colleagues on both sides of the aisle for decades have been raising their anti-Semitic hatred embedded in UNRWA. This year, my legislation, called the Stop Support for UNRWA Act of 2024, was passed by the Foreign Affairs Committee on February 6th by a vote of 30 to 19. It completely prohibits any U.S. contributions to UNRWA. My legislation, however, made it absolutely clear that, quote, nothing in this act may be construed to preclude the provision of humanitarian assistance to any agency or entity other than UNRWA, to individuals or entities that also receive assistance from UNRWA, if the Secretary of State certifies to Congress that such an agency or entity, quote, one, does not promote, espouse, or affiliate with entities or individuals that promote violence, terrorism, or anti-Semitism, as such term is defined by the IHRA working definition of anti-Semitism, and two, does not employ individuals who promote, espouse, or affiliate with such entities or individuals. The House report accompanying H.R. 7122, the Stop Support for UNRWA Act of 2024, very clearly and unambiguously summarizes the case against UNRWA and the due diligence by the Foreign Affairs Committee, including hearings prior to the markup. In March, the bipartisan foreign aid bill that President Biden signed into law included language prohibiting U.S. taxpayer funds to UNRWA through March 25th of 2025. Before the prohibition took effect, however, the Biden administration was already contributing nearly 30% of UNRWA's budget, about $1 billion. There is a pause. We don't know exactly what that means. We've been asking questions to try to determine what monies have flowed post-October 7th. But this progress, especially with the foreign aid bill, would not have happened without the hard work by a lot of people, including Chairman Mario Diaz-Balart, the chairman of the Foreign Ops Committee, and many of whom are in this room, most outstandingly by some of our witnesses. All three of you witnesses have made such an amazing, had an impact on what we do up here on Capitol Hill. You have worked tirelessly to research, document, and educate the world on UNRWA and its real relationship with terrorism, and as the major obstacle to peace between the Israelis and the Palestinians. So thank you, Mr. Lindsay. You were really the pioneer here with the analysis and expose you wrote in 2009. And thank you, Hillel and Yona, for your stellar work and the dedication in carefully documenting and informing us and the world about the anti-Semitic and destructive work of the UN and many of the NGO networks that the UN partners with. Thanks to your work, we have seen that shift. That vote that just occurred a few weeks ago would never have happened without the work that you've done. More and more people in Congress and the government are aware of the irreformable problems with UNRWA. It's by staying with this issue that Congress will effect change and eventually the effective elimination of UNRWA. When that happens, It will be a very good thing for all the peoples of the Middle East, whether Israeli, Palestinian, or any of the countries that maintain UNRWA institutions and missions. Our agenda for this hearing today is basically twofold. First, we have to examine the Colona report, which was set up solely to whitewash UNRWA's record, and second, the U.S. funding to organizations other than UNRWA, which are affiliated to terrorists or otherwise promote violence against the Israelis. Regarding the Colona report, it was in response to growing criticism of UNRWA, as well as the Israeli government's announcement that it had evidence that UNRWA employees had participated in the atrocities on October 7th, that the UN announced an independent, so-called, review of UNRWA. The mandate of the review, however, was restricted to UNRWA's neutrality procedures in order to avoid going into UNRWA's obligations to be independent and impartial, where it would have been impossible to hide its grotesque failures. Secretary General Guterres appointed Catherine Colona, a former French foreign minister, to lead the review. Colona has a long history of support for UNRWA and hostility towards Israel. Ms. Colona tapped 3 organizations to conduct the review. All of them have similar histories, including of throwing defamatory accusations such as genocide and apartheid at the state of Israel. Senior officials connected to the report repeatedly stated that their goal was to, quote, reassure donors and to provide the donors with further cover. Yet the report is still interesting as another side of changed times. The authors felt it necessary to make some concessions and admissions. Most of the 50 recommendations are strictly small ball items to remedy management deficiencies, which already have been repeatedly brought to the public attention by our witnesses and other watchdog groups and ignored by UNRWA for decades. Yet the Colona report concedes that UNRWA does not vet employees for connections or sympathies with Hamas or Islamic Jihad. The Colona report concludes that UNRWA is irreplaceable and indispensable. As Mr. Lindsay says in his written testimony, it is simply not true that UNRWA is irreplaceable. In every UNRWA field of operation, the local authorities provide services to those of their residents who are not defined as Palestinian refugees by UNRWA. These local authorities, if UNRWA resources eventually were transferred to them, would simply expand their operations, close quote. UNRWA, the UN Relief and Works Agency, was set up to provide, by way of background, in 1949, to provide aid to refugees. 74 years later, it has kept going by the UN General Assembly. There are few signs of the original refugees left. Almost all UNRWA so-called refugees today, in fact, belong to the vastly expanded number of children, grandchildren, and great-great-grandchildren of the original refugees. And they are only refugees because nearby Arab nations seeking to perpetuate Israel's problems will not permit the Palestinians to integrate into their societies. UNRWA textbooks, curricula, summer camps, official media all exist to perpetuate the problem, inflaming them with hatred of Israel and the ideology of returning to their ancestral villages, where they will continue to wage war on Israel. UNRWA, make no mistake about it, is an incubator of hatred, and it is a child soldier factory. Aspects of its propaganda are so twisted, I won't describe them here, but its publicity available materials encourage children to martyrdom as suicide bombers, the worst form of child abuse. UN Watch has published many pages of documentation on over 100 UNRWA teachers and their Facebook pages inciting to anti-Semitism, and praise to jihadi terrorism makes grim reading. UN Watch has also revealed that how, quote, as soon as news of the horrific slaughter broke, which was the live streamed on social media by some of the terrorists, United Nations Relief and Works Agency staff immediately celebrated and justified it on Facebook, close quote. UNRWA bears a heavy moral responsibility for the perversity we saw performed by Hamas in its October 7th invasion of Israel. I think the best thing for Palestinians and Israelis would be for the U.S. to pursue a two-track strategy. First, continue down the path of prohibiting U.S. funding to UNRWA, and that is the path that the Trump administration took in 2018, and that my legislation reestablished after the Biden administration restored it in 2021, and then the full House, Democrat, Republican alike, passed the legislation that continued that and made it law. Second, the U.S. should develop alternative ways to deliver aid to Palestinians. International aid organizations that are rigorously vetted by our government to be kept clean of associations with anti-Semitic or terrorist associations. This brings us to the second agenda item, U.S. funding to organizations other than UNRWA that are affiliated to terrorists or otherwise promote violence against Israelis. Congress is not voting to prohibit funding to UNRWA in order to have aid to the Palestinians channeled through other terrorist complicit organizations. Yet that seems to be happening. I don't know why the Biden administration is permitting this, yet it has been unresponsive to concerns I raised about this last September. At that time, it became clear that the State Department awarded a grant to an organization whose webpage showed ample evidence of working with and celebrating senior leaders of the Palestinian Islamic Jihad and the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, both of whom the United States government has designated as foreign terrorist organizations. We will learn today about other examples during the course of the hearing. One thing is clear: under absolutely no circumstances should the State Department be subsidizing an organization that promotes the killing of innocent Jews and terror attacks on Israel. I'd like to now yield to our very distinguished witnesses and thank them for making the trip to be here. In some cases, a very long trip. Hillel, thank you for traveling from Switzerland. And let me introduce our three distinguished witnesses. Beginning first with Hillel Neuer, an international lawyer, diplomat, writer, and activist. He is the executive director of UN Watch, a human rights NGO in Geneva, Switzerland. In 2018, McGill University awarded Mr. Neuer with an honorary doctorate of laws for his work to advance human rights and for being the voice for those without one. The university recognized Neuer as an innovator in creating global platforms for courageous dissidents and champions of human rights from around the world, and for being a passionate advocate for human rights, fighting tirelessly against discrimination, torture, and injustice. The Tribune of Geneva has described Mr. Neuer as a human rights activist who is feared and dreaded by the world's dictatorships. The Journal de Montreal wrote that Neuer makes the UN tremble. Israel's Ma'ariv, a newspaper, named him to its list of the top 100 most influential Jewish people in the entire world. Hillel Neuer is an acclaimed speaker who has testified often before the United Nations, the United States Senate, and the U.S. House. Then we'll hear from Mr. Yona Schiffmiller, Director of Research at NGO Monitor, a Jerusalem-based research institute. In his research, he is focused on issues related to the provision of humanitarian assistance, including the diversion of aid by terrorist organizations in Gaza and the West Bank. He authored and edited chapters of the 2015 publication Filling in the Blanks, analyzing misuse and diversion of aid in Gaza, as well as developments related to the 2014 conflict there. Yona also researched and has written on the nexus between terror-linked NGOs, and UN agencies, as well as the relationships between these organizations and donor governments. He has testified before the Israeli parliamentary committees addressing aid diversion, anti-Semitism on U.S. campuses, and other developments related to NGO-sponsored BDS initiatives. And I want to thank him for flying in from Jerusalem to be with us today. And then we will hear from Mr. James G. Lindsay, former General Counsel for UNRWA. I'll say that again, former General Counsel for UNRWA, and a former visiting fellow at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy. He has served as a trial attorney and senior attorney advisor in the criminal division of the U.S. Department of Justice, and as the Force Counsel and the General Counsel of the Multinational Force and Observers. And without objection, all of your full resumes will be made part of the record. Each of you very, very distinguished and learned, and we are grateful that you're here providing your inputs. Mr. Neuer, the floor is yours.
Chairman Smith, thank you for inviting me to testify at this important hearing. It means a lot because there are others who seek to disinvite me. Indeed, here in Washington on Monday, I was invited and a confirmed speaker in a panel debate at the Stimson Center. One of the witnesses who was scheduled to appear here, Andrew Hyde from the Stimson Center, is one of the panelists at that debate. It's a debate about allegations of bias at UNRWA. And the panelists are William Deere, the US representative of UNRWA, who's a professional lobbyist, and a former Jordanian official, and someone from the Stimson Center. I was a confirmed speaker as well. And suddenly I received an email several days ago informing me that I was disinvited. And it turns out, I was told by Barbara Slavin of the Stimson Center, that it was UNRWA. UNRWA's Washington representative, Mr. William Deere, who said that he would not appear unless I was disinvited, and so she chose to do the dishonorable thing, and I was canceled. So it means a lot that I'm invited here. Indeed, I would say this is not the first time that UNRWA has refused to debate me. I was invited to a hearing at the European Parliament about a month ago. UNRWA was invited as well. They receive more than 100 million euro a year from the European Union. They declined to appear. So UNRWA is trying to cancel me, but the US Congress, and under your chairmanship, we are able to share the truth. So I appreciate that. Now, what I would have told the panelists at this debate here in Washington on Monday is the following. The Colona report, which was released just a couple weeks ago, is, we're told, an independent audit that has given UNRWA a clean bill of health, exonerating the agency of all charges of its ties with terrorism. This headline was repeated around the world and was used by several countries to reinstate funding. There's one problem, though, Mr. Chairman. These claims are completely false. Let's examine each one. First, as you intimated, the notion that this was an independent audit is questionable at best. We know first how it began. This began by UNRWA itself. The Commissioner General of UNRWA, Mr. Philippe Lazzarini, decided in January, it's actually before the revelations of UNRWA employees engaging in terrorism, but in response to our revelations and some others about UNRWA incitement on social media, on the Telegram chat group of 3,000 UNRWA teachers that we exposed who celebrated the October 7th attacks. In response to all of these, Commissioner Lazzarini decided to initiate some kind of a review. And when doing so, he told the press that these claims about UNRWA's terror ties were, quote, disingenuous, politically motivated, and constituted a, quote, smear campaign. So the same head of UNRWA, who was setting up the inquiry at the same time, he characterized the allegations as a smear campaign. In doing so, he irreparably tainted the credibility of the inquiry. Now, he went on to select particular individuals. He selected Catherine Colona, the former foreign minister of France. That's not accidental that he chose her, just because just weeks earlier, she had tweeted a message out to him, to the public, praising UNRWA and saying how their work is more necessary than ever. This is days after we exposed the terrorgram, 3,000 UNRWA teachers in a group that celebrated the October 7th attacks. Madame Colona was praising UNRWA. So he chose someone who he knew very well was sympathetic to UNRWA, to say the least. She was also basically a board member of UNRWA because she sat on the advisory commission, as France sat on the advisory commission. France is the 4th largest donor. So the notion that she would make adverse findings against UNRWA is absurd. She would have been implicating herself had she done so in a very significant way. So she was chosen deliberately to give the predetermined result. And indeed, as you indicated, Mr. Chairman, the heads of the United Nations and of UNRWA told us exactly, they said it in their own words, what the report was all about. Indeed, the former spokesman for UNRWA, Chris Gunnis, who now acts as a surrogate, he appeared on Al Jazeera, and he said the following. He said that the report by the former French foreign minister, quote, will provide the donors with further cover, if that's what they need, with their own internal constituencies to resume funding for UNRWA. So he said the quiet part out loud. And then the Secretary General's spokesman said the point of the report is to, quote, reassure the donors. And indeed, Colona herself said that the point of her report was to allow donors to regain confidence where they have lost it or when they have doubt. So the whole point, it was fixed, Mr. Chairman. The Colona review group from the beginning was fixed. I'll just mention briefly the other members. There were 3 Scandinavian institutes that were chosen. None was chosen by accident. Each of them is an ardent supporter of UNRWA, groups that have accused Israel of genocide and apartheid. And, you know, there's one group called the Christian Michelson Institute, This is a group that has published a major report on UNRWA just 2 years ago, where they said that claims of UNRWA incitement are, quote, unfounded. So they picked groups that have a long record of attacking any reports of UNRWA incitement, and they chose another group called the Raoul Wallenberg Institute, which is a beautiful name named after someone who rescued Jews, but in fact, the head of this institute is the complete opposite of Raoul Wallenberg. His name is Per Lundberg, and he tweets out posts by the Electronic Intifada, which is an anti-Semitic group headed by Ali Abunimah, and he posted in 2014, must-see debate about UNRWA video, UNRWA's Chris Gunness demolishes anti-Palestinian activist on Fox. He has shared other tweets by Chris Gunness with UNRWA talking points attacking critics of UNRWA. So they deliberately picked individuals and groups that have a lengthy record of attacking any critics of UNRWA. So this was the least objective kind of group you could imagine. So in truth, this was not an independent audit. Those who created the review and the people who were selected indicate that it was fixed from the start. And in the large part, the review group provided the goods. The report says the following: UNRWA, quote, remains pivotal in providing life-saving humanitarian aid. UNRWA is irreplaceable and indispensable, a humanitarian lifeline. Mr. Chairman, we didn't need to have an independent review group of the French foreign minister and 3 Scandinavian institutes to produce those lines. Those words are the official UNRWA talking points. We have a video coming out soon where you will see dozens and dozens of ambassadors and other public officials, including sometimes from the US State Department, parroting these lines: life-saving, irreplaceable, lifeline, indispensable, over and over and over again. These are the UNRWA talking points. So to read the Guardian headline, Mehdi Hassan, who's an anti-Israel columnist on May 2nd in The Guardian, he used these words and this report to attack critics of UNRWA. He said, it shows the critics were all wrong, all spreading lies, all peddling Israeli propaganda. So this is how the report was used. It doesn't mean there aren't things in here that are useful. And I saw from Mr. Lindsay's testimony, there are certain things in here, despite the conclusions that they reached, which enabled Germany and Japan and others, indeed, that gave them the cover to resume funding. There are, of course, some things in the report that are useful. But, you know, this comes to the point that some of the myths about the report, the myth that we hear so often is no evidence was provided. Israel has never provided any evidence, we're told, about UNRWA complicity with terrorism. I'll quote from The Guardian on April 22nd, quote, Israel has yet to provide evidence of UNRWA staff terrorist links, says the Colona report. This was shared by Ken Roth, the former head of Human Rights Watch, and many, many others. Now, the interesting thing here, no evidence was provided, is that Colona herself, even though I'm critical of her, but Colona herself refuted that claim. When she presented her report in New York on April 22nd, she said the following. She said, some of these media quotes do not respect the text of the report. We've written UNRWA has not received evidence by Israel, not that there is no evidence. It's very different. These are 2 separate missions. Allegations regarding individuals is in the scope of the OIOS. That's the oversight agency. It's under their mission, she said. It's not the scope of our mandate. And she said it's no surprise that Israel did not provide evidence to UNRWA because it doesn't owe this evidence. These are her words. It doesn't owe this evidence during the OIOS investigation to UNRWA, but only to the OIOS. So even though Colona herself said that it's perfectly normal that Israel didn't give you the evidence to UNRWA, and they are giving it to OIOS, and Israel is cooperating, she said, with OIOS, which has returned to Israel a second time, and is investigating not only 12, but even more alleged UNRWA perpetrators. So the notion that Israel failed to provide evidence is false. Now, the other conclusion that they provided in the report that, and I'm quoting here, UNRWA has established a significant number of policies, mechanisms, and procedures to ensure compliance with a more developed approach to neutrality than any other similar UN or NGO entities, end quote. Really, Mr. Chairman, UNRWA is the best agency in the world, we're told, when it comes to compliance, when you and I know, and anyone who's seen the evidence know that the truth is the complete opposite. And when I read this, I thought, as others have, of Stalin's constitution. The truth is that Stalin's constitution, if you read the provisions, there are dozens of articles in the Soviet Union constitution that speak about direct election and freedom of conscience and all kinds of freedoms. But the reality was the complete opposite. You know, he adopted this constitution in 1936, right before the Great Terror, the Great Purge. The reality was the complete opposite in the Soviet Union. And yet it was proclaimed when his constitution came out as the most democratic in the world. That was the Soviet propaganda line. So the fact that UNRWA may have all kinds of procedures and mechanisms may entirely be true. But you and I know, Mr. Chairman, that the reality is the complete opposite. The reality is that we just saw days ago UNRWA vehicles driving around in Gaza next to gunmen, terrorists, coming in and out of the UNRWA vehicles. We know that it wasn't that long ago, a couple of months ago, when Israel exposed a terror tunnel directly underneath UNRWA headquarters in Gaza, and the terror tunnel had computer servers. It was a Hamas spy center, computer servers with electric cables going directly from the terror tunnel, from the Hamas computers into UNRWA headquarters, getting their electricity directly from UNRWA. And when Mr. Lazzarini in February was asked about this, his response on Twitter was, quote, "We do not know what is under UNRWA's headquarters. We do not know what's under UNRWA headquarters." But Mr. Chairman, a week before, the Wall Street Journal reported that 10 years prior, in 2014, folks at UNRWA had noticed that the parking lot was sinking. The parking lot was sinking. No one said anything. They knew exactly what it was about, but everybody knew. Wall Street Journal. No one said anything, everyone was silent, but everyone knew. Of course they knew. The only major construction project in Gaza was hundreds and hundreds of miles of terror tunnels. Next to my house in Geneva, they were building a massive tunnel for a train. We knew about it for a few years. Everyone at UNRWA knew what was going on, but everyone was silent. So the UNRWA line that they had no idea is simply not credible. No evidence of UNRWA terrorism. We exposed in January the 3,000 UNRWA teachers who belonged to the Terrorgram group that celebrated the October 7th attacks. We've exposed for 9 years, we've exposed UNRWA teachers and school principals who regularly praise Hitler, people like Elham Mansour, a teacher in Lebanon, who said, "By Allah, every Muslim must slaughter the Jews." She's an UNRWA teacher. Now, these aren't a few bad apples. UNRWA said it's a few bad apples. I'm just going to mention a few people. There's Su'ail al-Hindi. People think that the head of UNRWA is a nice Swiss guy named Philippe Lazzarini, and he's a great, very effective spokesperson telling lies about UNRWA. The truth is, I don't think he has any idea what's going on at UNRWA. He doesn't run things. The people who run things are people like Su'ail al-Hindi. He was the chief of the UNRWA staff union in Gaza for years, and in 2011, when UNRWA was embarrassed and suspended him, he mobilized Hamas. He's actually a member of Hamas. He was suspended because of his relations with Hamas. Hamas mobilized 8,000 UNRWA teachers. The entire staff of UNRWA went on strike in Gaza for months. They shut down 243 schools. 220,000 students were out of school to rally for months behind a Hamas Politburo member. Su'ail al-Hindi sits on the Hamas Politburo in Gaza with Yahya Sinwar, the master terrorist. And for years, he sat as the head of the UNRWA union. Eventually, because it became public, he had to resign. UNRWA didn't fire him, but they asked him to resign. So as far as I know, he's still collecting an UNRWA pension. And he's a leader of Hamas, celebrating the attacks, leading the Great March of Return. And there are several other examples in our reports, which can all be found at unwatch.org, repeatedly, when UNRWA teachers are exposed for their incitement. Thousands of UNRWA staff, whether it's in Gaza or in Lebanon, rally in their support. It's not a few bad apples. The rot goes all the way to the core, and the Colona report, sadly, misrepresents the situation in UNRWA. We know for 10 years that we've been sending them all of these reports. The response of UNRWA was to attack us. We've posted on the internet, on our website, unwatch.org, example after example of how we wrote to UNRWA, tried to engage, they refused to meet us, like the UNRWA representative here in Washington is trying to cancel me, and instead all they did was attack us. That's the truth, Mr. Chairman. Thank you very much.
Mr. Neuer, thank you so very much for that very very eloquent testimony and for your leadership. I would now like to recognize Mr. Schiffmiller.
Mr. Chairman, I thank you for convening today's hearing and for the opportunity to testify. Appearing today in my personal capacity, I'm the Director of Research for NGO Monitor, founded by Professor Gerald Steinberg in 2002. NGO Monitor is a globally recognized research institute promoting democratic values and good governance. By publishing independent analyses of NGOs, their funders, and other stakeholders, including UN agencies, we work to ensure that decision makers and civil society operate in accordance with the principles of accountability, transparency, and universal human rights. As has already been discussed extensively, failure at UNRWA is not new. For years, those who were willing to listen, including yourself, Mr. Chairman, were increasingly alarmed at the agency's hate-filled curriculum and periodic discoveries of weapons caches in its schools and members of US-designated terrorist organizations on its payroll. However, the scope of these and other disturbing phenomena that has surfaced since the Hamas-orchestrated October 7th massacre is overwhelming. As you and Mr. Neuer discussed, in response to mounting evidence of abuse at UNRWA, in February, the UN Secretary General impaneled a number of European NGOs, led by the former French Foreign Minister Catherine Colona, to investigate. Though deeply flawed, suffering from numerous biases and unreasonably sympathetic to the agency, the report, perhaps unwittingly, does hint at other structural flaws at UNRWA. Described in greater detail in my written testimony, these include, for example, the presence of a coercive environment undermining accountability and oversight mechanisms in Gaza. My written testimony also demonstrated that many of the worst behaviors displayed by UNRWA and its staff in Gaza are manifest in other humanitarian actors, including UN agencies as well as international and Palestinian NGOs. Among these shared problems are aid diversion, glorification of violence, and other ills. Mr. Chairman, the Stop Support for UNRWA Act of 2024 that you co-authored recognizes this fact, requiring certain assurances before taxpayer funds can be awarded to organizations that seek to fill in for UNRWA. As you noted in your opening statement, the Secretary of State must certify that such partners, quote, do not promote, espouse, or affiliate with entities or individuals that promote violence, terrorism, or anti-Semitism, end quote, and do not, quote, employ individuals who promote, espouse, or affiliate with such entities or individuals. Mr. Chairman, the significance of this clause cannot be overstated. It is a clear recognition of the fact that there exists a crisis of which UNRWA is but one horrifying example. A broad fundamental approach is required to prevent a repeat of the UNRWA debacle with other agencies and organizations. Rigorous vetting is required to ensure that U.S. assistance aligns with American policy goals and values, and to guarantee that taxpayer funds are not provided to terror-linked actors or to those that glorify violence and espouse anti-Semitism. In my written testimony, I presented instances in which U.S. vetting of Palestinian partners was insufficient, allowing taxpayer funds to flow to terror-linked organizations and to those that glorified violence. This included funding a Gaza-based organization in 2023 that openly called for, quote, armed resistance and hosted senior officials of the Palestinian Islamic Jihad, as well as to a West Bank group in 2022, whose head of the board attended a celebration of the anniversary of the founding of the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, the PFLP, both of which are US-designated terrorist organizations that participated in the October 7th massacre. Moreover, a 2021 NGO Monitor report revealed several instances of US support for Palestinian NGOs that worked with children and teens, presenting convicted terrorists as role models, celebrating specific attacks on Israeli civilians, and other similar actions. With $180 million in pledged support for humanitarian activities since Hamas's invasion, it is crucial that US partner vetting be both well-conceived and expertly implemented. In my written testimony, I provided recommendations for vetting such assistance, including through UN agencies. Before discussing these proposals, however, let me state what should be obvious. The defeat of Hamas is a prerequisite for any day-after humanitarian strategy. This is essential not only to the safety and security of Israelis, not only for the prosperity of Palestinians, but to any hopes of fundamentally changing the context and environment in which humanitarian and development aid take place. Let me now broadly outline the recommendations included in my written testimony. Firstly, partner vetting must include an independent review of publicly available information regarding an entity's activities and statements and those of its key officials as they pertain to supporting US-designated terrorist organizations, glorifying violence, or promoting anti-Semitism. The U.S. should assist in UN reform, ending the practice of UN agencies that fund, partner with, or solicit information provided by terror-linked NGOs and by organizations that support violence and anti-Semitism. Minimally, the U.S. should ensure that U.S.-funded agencies do not partner with such actors. Until sufficient and effective reform of UN mechanisms is implemented, U.S. contributions to the UN or to UN-coordinated NGO activity should include robust vetting standards to ensure that taxpayer funds are safeguarded from such organizations. Moreover, the U.S. should insist that relevant federal terror designations are applied to vetting partners on any UN project involving U.S. taxpayer funds. Lastly, U.S. funding should be awarded transparently, including the publication of the names of grantees and implementing partners, as well as the amount of funds awarded and descriptions of the projects that they are advancing. Simply put, Mr. Chairman, robust vetting must serve as the bedrock of U.S. funding to the West Bank and Gaza, especially as Congress considers its post-UNRWA engagement in the region. I thank you again for the opportunity to testify, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you so very much for your testimony and for your leadership. And again, from your reports, past and present, we've been able to act on many of those, raise it with the administration. So again, I want to thank you for that. Mr. James Lindsay, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, good afternoon again, and thank you for your invitation to testify about the Colona Independent Review's report on UNRWA. The Secretary General limited the review's mandate to UNRWA's neutrality, so the report does not discuss, let alone make any recommendations concerning many long-standing criticisms of UNRWA, two of which are particularly important and which I will mention. There are additional ones in my written testimony and in documents I have written over really the last 15 years. My original document on UNRWA was written in 2009 for the Washington Institute on Near East Policy, and that document, 15 years old, is still completely relevant because nothing has really changed. What the report doesn't address that I want to mention today is that firstly, that UNRWA should be using the UN Refugee Convention definition of a refugee, which provides that a person cannot be both a citizen under the protection of his state of residence and also a refugee at the same time. Adopting that definition would reduce UNRWA's claimed 5.9 million Palestine refugees by nearly a third. There are about 1.8 million of these oxymoronic citizen refugees in Jordan alone. All of this would save a considerable amount of funding. Secondly, UNRWA should be vetting its Palestine refugee beneficiaries, at least some of whose criminal histories would bar them from being considered refugees under the UN Refugee Convention. United States funds should not go to any Palestine refugee identified as supporting terrorism. The report itself, even though its recommendations were limited to aspects of neutrality, and even though, as we've heard from previous speakers, that the review group itself was not 100% neutral, the report still came up with 50 recommendations, the majority of which, by my own count, approximately 37, reflect obvious deficiencies, obvious management deficiencies, things that, like the need for training, better coordination with other agencies, better enforcement of rules, employing more women as managers, things that any competent management team would have long ago addressed without prodding from an independent review. Some of those management deficiencies, and I'll mention two, the decision not to vet staff for terrorist connections when hiring or retaining them, and the decision not to remove anti-Semitic, anti-Israel, and violence glorification from education materials. These items, these things I've mentioned, are in areas fundamental to the operation of any UN agency, or they should be. Moreover, these same issues have been brought to the attention of UNRWA's management repeatedly and over a period of literally decades. I was not the first person to write about some of these things, and I wrote 15 years ago. Yet these same deficiencies have remained unfixed, unattended to, and still had to be noted in the Colona report. In short, the recommendations in the Colona report reflect both a lack of competent management and a decades-long willful obstruction of some fundamental reforms. They thus constitute a damning indictment of UNRWA's current and past leadership. There is a remark in the report, which has been mentioned here already, that was made in passing and that led to a media misconception regarding certain Israeli allegations. The report specifically noted that Israel made public claims that a significant number of UNRWA employees in Gaza are members of terrorist organizations, but Israel has yet to provide supporting evidence of this. That quoted statement has been widely interpreted by the media to mean that UNRWA does not employ significant numbers of terrorists and/or terrorist supporters. That interpretation is certainly wrong. The Israeli accusations regarding the 13,000 or so UNRWA staff members in Gaza were that about 1,200 of them were Hamas members and about 6,000 of them were related to Hamas members. Those accusations actually ring true, given two well-known facts. Firstly, Hamas has significant support amongst the people of Gaza. For instance, a March 2024 poll by a reputed, well-reputed Palestinian pollster indicated that about 40 to 60% of Gaza residents are supportive of Hamas. Secondly, taking that pool of workers, for this is where UNRWA draws its employees in Gaza, UNRWA makes no effort to exclude from its hiring process persons with Hamas connections or sympathies. Other things being equal, from those two known facts, one could reasonably assume that approximately 40 to 60% of UNRWA's 13,000 Gaza employees are in fact supporters or members of Hamas, which actually is not that different from what the Israelis alleged. After the horrors of October the 7th and the subsequent revelations concerning UNRWA staff participation in those horrors, the decades-long discussion about how can we finally force reforms on recalcitrant UNRWA has, in many cases, moved on to the question, do we really need such an incompetent and malfunctioning agency? Speaking directly to that subject, as other speakers have mentioned, the Colona report mirrors the views of UNRWA and the UN Secretary General, stating in one case, UNRWA is irreplaceable and indispensable to Palestinians' human and economic development. Yet it is simply not true that UNRWA is irreplaceable. In every UNRWA field of operation, the local authorities provide services, including things like health and education, to those of their residents who are not defined as Palestine refugees by UNRWA. These local authorities, if UNRWA's resources and responsibility for Palestine refugees were transferred to them, could simply expand their operations. If an adjustment period were necessary, other UN international and NGO organizations could provide temporary assistance with what were formerly UNRWA's responsibilities. The bottom line, UNRWA is replaceable, and given the Colona report's revelations that UNRWA's leadership is both incompetent and willfully obstructionist of fundamental reforms, UNRWA should be replaced. There are only three ways to bring an end to UNRWA's operations. The General Assembly, which created UNRWA by a resolution, could officially end it the same way. As UNRWA is almost wholly financially dependent on donations from mostly Western governments, those donor governments could halt their funding. And thirdly, lastly, a host state, such as Lebanon, Syria, Jordan, or Israel, could refuse UNRWA access to territory under its control. As a practical matter, we know the General Assembly will not take action to end UNRWA's mandate. But a halt in donor funding, combined with a refusal to allow UNRWA access to one or more of its fields of operation, would, as a practical matter, end UNRWA's mandate in those fields of operation. The current situation, in conclusion, the U.S. is that the U.S. is prevented by law, as you've mentioned, Mr. Chairman, from donating funds to UNRWA until next March, and has been transferring aid funds to other international organizations in Gaza. And Israel seems to be decreasing UNRWA's access to Gaza in favor of other aid providers, such as the World Food Program. Thus, whether by design or by accident, at the moment, the U.S. and Israeli governments seem to be working together to accomplish a desirable outcome, a Gaza freed of terrorist control and a Gaza provided aid via organizations that are less likely to be compromised by terrorist supporting employees. With that in mind, the U.S. halt to UNRWA funding should be extended beyond the present expiry date of 25 March 2025, with any U.S. aid to Gaza being delivered by other organizations. Mr. Chairman, that concludes my remarks. I thank you again for the opportunity to testify today, and I look forward to any questions you may wish to direct to me.
Mr. Lindsay, thank you so very much. And maybe I could just ask you, you were the general counsel, the top lawyer for UNRWA, and obviously you saw things that you didn't like, and now you are speaking out very powerfully against continuing funding to them. Maybe, especially so the record is clear, could you give us some insights as to what you saw that caused you to have a change of heart?
There were a number of things that occurred that concerned me. It mostly had to do with things, for instance, I remember being concerned about a requirement from the State Department. There is a Section 301C, which requires every year, or did when I was in Gaza anyway, a representation, a statement from UNRWA that it had done everything possible to avoid money being provided, funds being provided to support people who were receiving military training or who were otherwise involved with terrorist organizations. That's not the exact language, but that's the essence of it. And I complained about this because we, meaning UNRWA, were doing this every year, and yet it was quite clear we were doing almost nothing to identify such people. We did not ever ask anyone if they were members of Hamas or members of any terrorist organization. One of the Commissioner Generals when I was there actually made a statement, which was published in Canadian media, saying, yes, I know we have Hamas people working for us, but it's not something we worry about. That sort of thing concerned me. Some of these things that I mentioned in my paper from 2009 for the Washington Institute had to do with some of the things that are mentioned in the Colona report, actually. And they did not change. I mentioned them to management, but the situation in UNRWA was not receptive to things that were at all critical of what was being done already. And I did not continue doing that during my time in UNRWA. I did it at the beginning. I pointed out difficulties, I pointed out issues, and I was rebuffed, and so I moved on.
I think the record should note it takes a tremendous amount of courage to stand up to what you have stood up to, having been there, seeing firsthand, and then you took a very principled stand to say, this is not the way it should be. So I really applaud that. It's such a principled position.
Mr. Chairman, I don't want to exaggerate. I did what I did, but as I said, when my ideas were not received with any sort of pleasure, I didn't make those in the future. Some of the ones that I identified, as I've just mentioned to you, I did mention, I did raise these issues. I did complain from a legal standpoint that these they should not be done this way, but I was rebuffed, so I didn't repeat them.
As the largest donor of U.S. aid to UNRWA for decades, Mr. Neuer, could you tell us, was UNRWA a reliable agency where the money that we provided for across the board was being utilized effectively?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And let me just say that since I last appeared here, the U.S. Congress has passed bipartisan legislation signed by the President, which prohibits any funding of UNRWA for at least the next year, and I want to congratulate you for your leadership in making this happen. It's a very significant move. Regarding aid, we are told that we need to give money to UNRWA to help the Gazans who do need help, and of course it's our position that the Gazans should be helped in every way possible. The question is whether UNRWA is the right one. And we just released a report last week on May 8th, whereby it's on our website, unwatch.org, and was widely reported. UNRWA staff are stealing aid. They're selling it for profit, while those who report it face reprisals. This is based on numerous reports that have been published by Palestinians in Gaza in an UNRWA-related chat room. There's a former UNRWA official who runs a chat room, and there's, I'll just read out some of the reports that were made from Gazans. A gentleman named Dr. Izzat Shatat says, open thefts from UNRWA shelter workers. The director of a school warehouse came with 50 cartons of food, distributed in UNRWA schools, and he sold them to a merchant for $100 per carton. How did he take out this amount of cartons? Where is the administration? So people are openly asking in this chat room, why is UNRWA not doing anything? An UNRWA staffer, Muhammad Musa al-Sawalhi, recounts abuses by UNRWA employees. 80% of employees in the shelters have no morals or dignity, he says. They have their homes full of aid, and not only them, but their loved ones with him. Someone named Dima in the chat group says, when will the directors of UNRWA centers in schools, especially Rafah Preparatory Girls School B, stop stealing the food and needs of the displaced? So these are just, Mr. Chairman, a handful of countless messages accusing, this is from Gazans, UNRWA staff, including directors, of stealing aid at the expense of Gazans who are in need. And yet for the past months, these calls by people in Gaza have fallen on deaf ears. So I think it's fair for us to ask Mr. Lazzarini, his representative here in Washington, William Deere, I don't think they agree to appear before the Congress, why, when whistleblowers are saying nothing has been done, what is UNRWA's response to this?
Which I've read very carefully, as you have as well. In the reporting and intake of allegations, I was struck by what seemed to be very laudatory language, but it lacks credibility, that all UNRWA staff and personnel have an obligation to report misconduct and, in turn, a right to be protected from retaliation from such reports. You just talked about petty theft, which when somebody is starving, taking food out of their mouth is a very serious thing. But here we're talking about other kinds of, the gross anti-Semitism, which UNRWA is known for decades, especially recently. It said there were 21 alleged breaches per year. And I looked in vain in this entire report to see who made the allegation. It's almost like, turning yourself into the IRS, the Internal Revenue Service. Do you think someone's going to do that? If they bring an allegation, what happens? Do they get visited by someone who, from Hamas? What happens? There's nothing in here to indicate the disposition of these cases and whether or not there's an encouragement for whistleblowers. And just as a matter of historical memory, right here in this room, years ago, Dick Thornburg, our former U.S. Attorney General, made an impassioned plea. This was in the 1980s. I've been here since 1980. He said, we need whistleblowers and we need people who will speak out to investigators when there's wrongdoing without fear of retaliation. And the UN has failed miserably in that in general. In this room, when UN peacekeepers in DR Congo were raping little kids, I went over to Goma and met with the peacekeepers, and I met with some of the victims. And then I had 4 hearings on it. And what struck me was that my 3rd hearing was, even Kofi Annan did a zero toleration of any kind of human trafficking by any of his peacekeepers, but they had 0 compliance. It was one big sham. Now, fast forward back to here. Here we have 21 alleged breaches that it's at least documented in this. No idea whatsoever what became of them, how serious were they. And then you pointed out, Mr. Schiffmiller, that recent reporting has addressed the extent of Hamas's penetration into UNRWA staffing. Citing Israeli intelligence sources, on January 29, 2024, the Wall Street Journal wrote that, quote, 23% of UNRWA's male employees had ties to Hamas, and nearly half of all UNRWA employees, an estimated 49%, also had close relatives who had official ties to the militant groups, especially Hamas. I've read the Hamas charter several times. I read it on the floor of the House, portions of it, excerpts, where it says, if you see a Jew behind a rock, kill him. I mean, that is the most lethal, violent anti-Semitism. Doesn't matter who they are, a little boy, a little girl, man or a woman, kill them because they have to be Jewish. And now we have a situation where we have no idea from this report, but it makes it sound like, geez, they're on top of this. There's a reporting capacity. If we do, I would like to invite Ms. Colona to testify here. I'd love to have her. I will. I'll send a letter and ask her to come and testify, give an accounting for the unbelievable lapses and gaps in this. And I do think it's a whitewash of the worst kind. And I am very concerned. And if you could speak to this idea of somebody coming forward, who do they talk to? Are they protected? And then what is done? And if it's found out that so-and-so said Hamas is doing this or doing that, or simple petty theft, what happens to that person?
Mr. Chairman, I agree the report in too many ways does not capture the reality and seems to be indifferent to reality. Indeed, in Gaza, when time and again, and this they do address maybe for the first time in an official report, that the staff unions are often run, they say, by political parties, well, terrorists. Suhail al-Hindi is a leading terrorist. He is a leader of the Hamas terrorists, fully active in leading what they're doing in massacring Israelis. He was the head of the staff union in Gaza. So the notion that someone could report him or other teachers and school principals and not face repercussions is absurd. I have to say that one of my great disappointments with the report, we saw early on the review group, there aren't very many groups that are exposing UNRWA promotion of terrorism. It's our group, a group Impact to SC, maybe 1 or 2 others at most. And they didn't reach out to us. We were part of a mass email saying you could submit something, but they didn't meet with us. Neither Madame Colona nor any of the 3 groups didn't bother to meet with us, didn't ask us, since we're basically the main group that have, for 10 years have been sending warnings about UNRWA support for terrorism, sending allegations. The natural thing would be, can you folks share your experiences? How does UNRWA respond to your allegations? They didn't contact us, and indeed we sent them a lengthy submission. It's on our website with evidence. There's no reference to it anywhere in their report. So in our experience, as you said, Mr. Chairman, the review group did not seem to be interested in really capturing the reality. They looked at superficialities, again, talking about procedures and mechanisms and policies, like the Stalinist constitution. That's not very serious.
Mr. Schiffmiller, would you want to speak to that?
Certainly, Mr. Chairman. I would just add that these sorts of pressures that we see, we talked about whistleblowers and the ability to come forward, and as you said, is anybody going to turn themselves into the IRS? We've seen this happen elsewhere in Gaza. It's not just an UNRWA problem. So a couple of years ago, the director of Gaza operations for World Vision, which is a multinational, very, very large humanitarian aid organization, was convicted of diverting aid to Hamas, aid materials and funds themselves. And one of the things that emerged from his conviction was that there was a whistleblower in World Vision, an accountant that worked in World Vision in Gaza, who was concerned about the diversion of funds, reported this to his superiors, and he was then fired. Not only was he fired, he was then arrested by Hamas, interrogated by Hamas, and the materials related to that interrogation were found on the computer of the World Vision employee in question, who was later convicted, suggesting very, very clearly that when you have Hamas control over a territory, and you have organizations that are operating there, and you have Hamas operatives operating within those organizations, it becomes nearly impossible to advance any sort of accountability, any sort of oversight within the organizations. And again, this is unfortunately not an UNRWA problem, or it is a problem at UNRWA, but it's not an UNRWA-specific problem. This is something that's endemic to organizations that are operating in terror-controlled areas.
Let me just ask you, in the Colona report, it talks about neutrality of staff, part of this whole neutrality narrative, but it admits UNRWA faces challenges due to increased politicization among its staff affecting its neutrality. I mean, we know that that's a problem, but they say it here. Then they have, update the neutrality framework, all this gobbledygook talk, and yet they do at least acknowledge that they're facing challenges as it becomes much more politicized, and I would say much more hate-filled and anti-Semitic. How do you respond to this, the trend line of neutrality or lack thereof of their staff?
Well, I think that, again, this is an issue that is related not so much to UNRWA specifically, but to the environment in which UNRWA is operating. When you have a territory that is controlled by a terrorist organization, that necessarily brings pressures on any institution that's operating there. And we see this, again, not just with UNRWA, we see this with a whole slew of NGOs operating in the West Bank and Gaza, including organizations that partner with UN agencies, including organizations that are funded by European governments. One of the best examples I think that we've come across over the last few years is a Palestinian group called the Union of Agricultural Work Committees. This is an organization whose members are, many of their members are linked to the PFLP, again, a US designated terrorist organization. Some of their members are currently on trial for their role in the murder of a 17-year-old Israeli girl in 2019 in a bombing attack. And this is an organization that has been audited independently by a Dutch organization that found dozens of members of UAWC that were simultaneously acting as terrorist operatives and members of the PFLP. As a result of that, the Dutch government has said that it will no longer fund them. The German government recently revealed that it will no longer fund them. And so this sort of just expands that phenomenon to show that when you have terrorist organizations either controlling territory or able to operate openly and freely in a territory, that will necessarily lead to all sorts of, shall we say, associations and affiliations in the civil society or the supposedly civil society organizations that are operating in that territory.
In the report, it notes that in 2020, UNRWA launched a series of measures referred to as the management initiatives to reinvigorate and strengthen its management system. However, in several critical areas, such as oversight, have not been sufficiently addressed. How come we keep hearing that same refrain year after year, decade after decade? When I raised decades ago these issues, I met with the UNRWA representatives, and I got all these platitudes about how they were fixing it. And then we see time and time again, it doesn't get fixed. It actually degrades and gets worse. Why would any reasonable man or woman take any stock that this is the time? The gig, in my opinion, is up. This is a whitewash and a very cruel one because people have died. But it also, in my opinion, and I said this in my opening, I do believe that the UNRWA textbooks and the teachings in the schools, in Gaza especially, have been an incubator of hate towards for Jews and for Israelis in general, and Americans. But it's also, I do a lot on child soldiers. I wrote the Trafficking Victims Protection Act of 2000 and 4 others thereafter. I'm the prime author of those laws. We put child soldier provisions into that law. And now we see when you teach somebody to hate so strongly, are we surprised that they become very young haters of Jewish people and then child soldiers in their teens? Hillel.
Mr. Chairman, the notion, again, that we can go back to UNRWA. UNRWA said they immediately embrace all the reforms. This is absurd. Nothing here is new. There are some new elements that are mentioned here, but all of these things are known to UNRWA for at least a decade, and in many cases longer before. But certainly for us, since August 2015, we have been warning UNRWA about their staff promoting terrorism and their response. I'm going to read just a few quotes from their spokesperson. When we revealed that UNRWA teachers were inciting terrorism, he says, he attacked us on Twitter, quote, UN Watch makes a fool of itself, credibility dead in the water. Will anyone believe them again? The next day, August 26, 2015, appeal to journalists. Please don't turn UN Watch baseless allegation about anti-Semitism into a he said, she said story. It's a non-story. Year after year, time and again, when we did what UNRWA failed to do, to hold to account their staff for promoting terrorism, and we saw the end result, that we have thousands of Gazans, at least half of them will be UNRWA graduates, carried out mass rape, mass murder, torture, a kidnapping of Israelis. At least half of them are going to be UNRWA graduates, and they were given these messages of hate, which we long documented. And UNRWA's response was to attack us. There's nothing in the report saying that UNRWA systematically, their leading people, attacked us for exposing promotion of terrorism. And let's go back to really what UNRWA is, as Dr. Einat Wilf has shown in her book, The War of Return, and as she has stated numerous times, support for terrorism at UNRWA is not a bug, it's a feature. The whole point of UNRWA is to tell Palestinians in Gaza, for example, and you see videos, they tell children, is your home here in Gaza? And the child says, no, where's your home? Your home is in Jaffa, in Akko, in Israel. So when we, Mr. Chairman, give hundreds of millions of dollars to Gazans in cement and give them cement to build homes, hospitals, and schools, when UNRWA teaches them, your home isn't here in Gaza, we should not be surprised that they are not going to use that cement to build homes in Gaza, but to build hundreds of miles of terror tunnels, to tunnel into Israel, and to perpetrate terrorism. That is what we should expect. That is UNRWA's narrative, and the Palestinians embrace it. Their return is not a peaceful return. We saw the Al-Aqsa flood. That is how they imagine the return, in the most violent and brutal ways. And as long as UNRWA will exist, sadly, we can expect more October 7th massacres to happen. UNRWA, the existence of UNRWA, sadly, will guarantee more grievance, resentment, hatred, and terrorism.
There's an appalling lack of transparency in all of this. Let me just make clear, audience members, that disruption of committee proceedings is against the law. Holding up signs or making verbal outbursts is disruptive and will not be tolerated. We were asking if the police would, John, leave it. Yeah, where? So we'll pause for a brief moment, and then we will continue the hearing. Right. Okay. Let me just ask a question, if I could. Let me ask a question of our distinguished panelists. Maybe you, Yona, especially. You had given to us some information that we took, Mike Bilirakis and I wrote to the State Department about the Phoenix Center. $90,000 of U.S. taxpayer funding was provided to them. They have workshops and discussions with senior leaders of the Palestinian Islamic Jihad and the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine. All these events, flags of the terrorist organizations prominently displayed, and they call for armed resistance. We asked the State Department, we asked Secretary Blinken for an answer. Why did you give them $90,000? We still haven't heard back from them. I appreciate that you made us aware of that, but if you could maybe elaborate on that kind of funding. Hopefully it's over, but it's just very disturbing.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I agree that it is very disturbing, and it's disturbing for two reasons. The first is, of course, it should never have come to pass that U.S. taxpayer funds were distributed to an organization that openly calls for a third intifada, for armed resistance, and openly works with and gives a platform to members of a U.S. designated terrorist organization, in this case, the Palestinian Islamic Jihad. The second reason, however, why it's disturbing is that all of this information, all of the incriminating information was public. It all existed on this organization's own website, or on, in certain cases, there were statements that were made public by members of the organization. And so proper vetting, simple basic vetting of an organization like this should have discovered this type of material. And that gets to changes that have been made over the last few years in the way that USAID conducts vetting. There was a push a few years ago by an organization seeking to change USAID vetting that got the agency to change the guidelines, the regulations for how second-tier partners are vet. And previously, until changes were made in May of 2020, if you were a USAID-funded organization that wanted to work with a secondary partner, in order to satisfy anti-terror vetting requirements, what you would need to do is you would need to consult available public information and make a determination as to whether or not this organization was up to US standards when it came to anti-terror vetting. That standard was then changed and narrowed, made a little bit more legalistic to say all you need to do is consult the OFAC list. Now, obviously, OFAC is an important tool and an important resource in the fight against terror funding, but OFAC is looking at a very narrow set of parameters. They're looking at whether or not you're engaged in terror financing, whether or not the organization itself is producing weapons and explosives and things of that nature. They're not looking at every single Palestinian organization operating in the West Bank and Gaza to see if they're promoting incitement and hatred and violence on their websites. And so when you have a very narrow, very legalistic view, you're going to miss these sorts of materials, and that's why we feel that it's crucial that publicly available information, the types of information that organizations are publishing, that they're putting out themselves, should be part of the vetting process and should be part of the review process to ensure that organizations like this aren't funded again in the future.
Let me ask you, in the report, it says the chair recommends that there be a ban of any hate speech inciting to violence and/or anti-Semitic references from host country textbooks. In the meantime, stop using such material. That's an admission that, one, it's happening, and that kind of admonishment is what we often got verbally when we would talk to UNRWA officials. Oh, we want it stopped, and then it continues and even expands. I thought that was quite an admission where they are saying, go and ban it now, because it's not banned now, if you want to speak to that, because it's very disturbing about the textbooks. I had a hearing once here, and we had a person with a pile of textbooks, and he read from them. And he said, this is what these young children have imposed upon them in these UNRWA schools. And not only was it anti-Semitic and anti-Israel, it was anti-American. So it's been a common thread for, as you pointed out, all of you, for decades. If you wanted to respond to that. I also would ask you, this report, I hope, doesn't become the template for the Biden report pursuant to the pause, where we get a whitewash again that uses, like I said, this is a template for how they might respond to it. And, I called from the start, and I'm not the only one, for a top-to-bottom review of UNRWA. I mean, a real probe, not some superficial thing that this turns out to be. And we didn't get it, and I hope we don't get it from the Biden administration. Top-to-bottom review, your thoughts on that? Yes, Mr. Lindsay.
The issue regarding the textbooks and the material in them has been with UNRWA for literally decades, long before I wrote about it.
I read all that, yeah.
UNRWA has given a number of excuses for this. One of them is that they have to use local textbooks because otherwise, when their graduates go on to high school, since UNRWA does not teach high school except in Lebanon, they will be disadvantaged, which of course doesn't make a whole lot of sense since the things that are complained about have to do not with overall historical things, but with glorification of attacks, glorification of people who have committed attacks, and silly language like, this is not something I remember specifically seeing since I don't read Arabic anyway, but the things quoted were things like if you manage to kill 3 Jews, if there were 6 Jews and you kill 3, how many Jews are left? Again, that's not something that I'm taking, that's not literally in one of the books, but it's things like that, where you take a non-discriminatory thing like 6 minus 3 is 3, and you turn it into a political thing and a terrorist basic thing. And with stuff like that, that was present, and that it didn't make any sense to me that it couldn't be removed.
Mr. Lindsay, in your testimony, you pointed out that the imperative to recommend not only increased vetting of UNRWA staff, but also of the beneficiaries. You know, I'm a very strong proponent of refugee protection, and I have been for my entire career. And we know when there's a well-founded fear of persecution and all of the key elements to be found in that. But if you're an economic migrant, you're not a refugee. You're an economic migrant, and it needs. And you make that point. Could you elaborate on that? Because you talked about how that would save a substantial amount of money because these people are not refugees.
The people I was talking about are people who have obtained citizenship in the country where they are. To be fair, that is mostly Jordan, and to be fair, I think that's to Jordan's credit, because the other countries have been very reluctant to do that. Lebanon did naturalize some of the refugees. At the time, it was mostly the Christian refugees. So the ones who are left who are not naturalized are mostly non-Christians. But the point is that these states, when they give citizenship to someone and are responsible for the protection of that person, you cannot really say that that person is in danger the way a true refugee is. So it makes very little sense for a UN, quote, refugee, unquote, organization to be providing education and health care and social welfare and several other things as well to people for whom the ultimate responsibility is their country.
Before we conclude, is there anything any of you, yes, gentlemen, think we may have missed that you would like to convey to the committee?
Mr. Chairman, you mentioned the administration, and I was concerned that in statements made in New York and in Geneva in response to the Colona report, we did not hear from the administration the obvious objections that the members of the review group were not independent, that the Commissioner General, when he initiated the report, announced in advance what the outcome would be. So, and when they concluded that UNRWA is a lifeline and life-saving and irreplaceable and all the rest, these are all long-used talking points that are clearly not the conclusion of an independent investigation. The administration should be saying this. The administration should be objecting, but they didn't. They said they took it seriously, and even they told the United Nations, you know, we're very proud. You know, it's those who banned funding, that's the Congress, not us. We are very proud that we pushed out $121 million early on in the year in January and gave it to UNRWA. So there is a disconnect, and I wish that the administration would take the evidence seriously. The evidence is that there is widespread support for terrorism among UNRWA staff. It's UNRWA union leaders, and that UNRWA has failed to take this seriously. UNRWA has attacked groups like ours that have exposed this, and I would like the administration to hold UNRWA to account, and instead, it's not the message that we're hearing.
Mr. Chairman, the one thing I would like to do really, I think, is to reemphasize what Mr. Schiffmiller has said about the nature of a totalitarian government or a terrorist government, which is what you have had in Gaza since 2007. It leads to no one being able to provide whistleblowers, because anyone who does is treated very severely. And it also means that the education systems on the ground, and this would include the the UNRWA education systems are going to be dominated by the terrorist people. So even if you have a teacher who is not a member of Hamas, who is not a supporter of Hamas, that teacher is going to be terrified to teach anything other than what Hamas says that she must teach. If she does what, let's say, the UNRWA people say, and the UNRWA people make these nice documents that say, this is what you're supposed to teach. If she tries to teach that, she will be severely punished by the terrorists who run everything on the ground. So to people in the headquarters of UNRWA, it may look like all the documents are out there, everything is done perfectly, we have all kinds of evidence. Exactly what you said about the Soviet Constitution, Mr. Chairman. It's the same thing. What happens on the ground has very little connection to these sort of ethereal ideas that people think have some meaning, but they have no meaning on the ground in a terrorist state. Thank you.
Thank you. And that's from we have some media who are watching this remotely, and that's from the man who was the General Counsel of UNRWA. I mean, that is so profound. Thank you. Yoni?
Mr. Chairman, I'll just add, much of our back and forth focused on the issue of vetting and how the United States ensures that the organizations and agencies that it's partnering with are groups that are not linked to terrorists, don't support terrorism, don't espouse anti-Semitism. One of the phenomena that we have come across, and that's been very concerning to us at NGO Monitor, is that there is a very concerted, very, very strong effort on the part of a number of organizations within the humanitarian community to try to downgrade and to try to blunt anti-terror vetting procedures. And this sort of takes two separate tracks. One is to allow as much contact and as much engagement with terrorist organizations as possible. And you see this in publications put out by the Norwegian Refugee Council. You see this in publications put out by OCHA, by the UN's own Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs. And secondly, you also see a very, very strong push to deny vetting of beneficiaries. So I mentioned the Norwegian Refugee Council. Just a few years ago, the head of the NRC at a conference that was convened by the French Foreign Ministry said we need blanket humanitarian exemptions, no vetting of ultimate beneficiaries. And you see that in a number of pieces of literature that the NRC has published. This call for saying there should be no vetting on what they call non-humanitarian grounds or political grounds. Even saying at one time that, the fact that somebody may or may not be a member of a designated terrorist organization, that does not focus, that should not be a part of the humanitarian needs assessment when funding is distributed. And this is an organization that receives hundreds of millions of dollars from the US government. And so when you see that level of influence, when you see that type of ideology, it is an important, I think, obstacle that needs to be considered when we talk about improving vetting, is not only how do we develop and how do donor governments develop the proper methodologies and the proper procedures, but also understanding there is a lot of opposition that exists to these sorts of pushes from within the humanitarian community.
Thank you. I'll just conclude with this. It is disappointing in the extreme, Mr. Neuer, that you provide all of this information and documentation submitted to Colona for her report, and you don't even get the courtesy of a acknowledgement of the data. Certainly, it might have been just thrown in the local wastebasket or shredded, and I find that appalling. You got to receive information from all sides to make an informed decision. Let me also say that this report, when I read it at the end of April, I was shocked. It is surface appeal arguments. We live in a world where people are very good at spinning surface appeal argumentation. That's all this thing is. It lacks intellectual honesty. It is a whitewash, and I will invite Ms. Colona to come and testify, and don't think there's not precedent for it. When I was fighting against the abuse by UN peacekeepers in DR Congo, I had 4 hearings, 2 of them. We had people from the United Nations come down, Jane Hall-Lute, who did a magnificent job, frankly. She had worked in our government, but then worked at the UN on trying to stop the exploitation of little children by the peacekeepers in and around Goma. So, I don't want to hear that they can't do it or they don't want to do it. We can do it right here, and I will invite her by way of letter immediately. So we will have hard questions for them. Again, no more surface appeal, no more whitewash. The hearing's adjourned.